Your kind doesn't build things that last. You borrow, you spend, and you disappear. My daughter deserves better than a man who'll be gone before the ink dries on anything he signs. He said it the way men say things they've rehearsed, so long they've stopped hearing how they sound. Loud enough for the table. Loud enough for the neighbors on the other side of the garden wall. Loud enough to make sure Emmett heard it the way it was meant to be, did. As a verdict, not an opinion. Emmett Cole stood in the Whitfield family's dining room with his jacket still on, because no one had told him to take it off, and he understood in that moment that no one was going to. He was 22 years old. He had $38 in his checking account and a second-hand blazer and a girl across the table who loved him and could not find her voice, and the man at the head of the table had just explained to a room full of people exactly what Emmett was worth. Emmett did not argue. He thanked them for the dinner he had barely touched, set his napkin on the chair, and walked out through the front door of a house he would never enter again as a guest. 4 years later, he came back and bought the land the house was sitting on. Savannah in late summer had a way of sitting on you. The heat came up from the pavement and the river at the same time, and the Spanish moss hung so still it looked painted, and the whole city moved the way things move when they have been beautiful long enough to stop trying. Emmett had grown up 2 miles from the historic district, in a neighborhood that didn't get written about in the travel magazines, and he had spent enough of his childhood pressing his face against the glass of this other Savannah to know exactly what it smelled like from the outside. He came back on a Wednesday in August, driving a rental car he had chosen specifically because it looked like a car a contractor's project manager would drive. Not new enough to draw attention, not old enough to suggest hardship. A man could move through Savannah unnoticed if Savannah had already decided who he was, and Savannah, like most old cities, had very fixed opinions about young black men from the wrong side of the district line. The Whitfield portfolio was not what it used to be. Emmett had spent 18 months making sure he understood exactly how much it was not what it used to be. Franklin Whitfield had built his family's name on commercial real estate and a reputation for being the kind of man whose handshake meant something, and for a long time that had been enough. But reputations are currency and currency inflates, and the Whitfield holdings had been hemorrhaging quietly for 3 years. A failed mixed-use development in Midtown, a hotel renovation project that ran 18 months over and burned through reserves that were supposed to cover 2 other properties, a marina lease that had been restructured twice and was now technically in breach. The one property keeping everything afloat was a waterfront commercial building on River Street. 3 stories of restored 19th-century cotton warehouse that the Whitfields had spent $11 million renovating 7 years ago, and that still, somehow, generated enough rental income to service the debt on everything else. It was the load-bearing wall of the entire family enterprise. Emmett knew this because he had read every public filing, every court record, every deed transfer in the Chatham County database, and then he had paid someone to read everything that wasn't public. And the picture that emerged was of a family standing on one leg. The building was called Whitfield Exchange. It had been Franklin's flagship, the thing he pointed to when he wanted people to understand what the Whitfield name meant in this city. Emmett had not come to admire it. He had come because the management contract on Whitfield Exchange was up for renewal at the end of the quarter, and the property management firm that had held it for 5 years was in quiet negotiations to exit. And if that contract went unsigned for more than 60 days, the primary lender had a covenant clause that would allow them to demand immediate review of the entire loan structure. Emmett knew this because his attorney, a meticulous woman named Beverly Okafor, who billed more per hour than Emmett had made in an entire year at his first job, had been tracking the Whitfield debt structure since the previous spring. He did not need to do anything dramatic. He only needed to be standing in the right place when the right tile fell. He got himself hired through a facilities management subcontractor, working a minor repair contract on Whitfield Exchange's HVAC system. His paperwork said all the right small things: a contractor's license, a commercial system certification, references that traced back to companies he had quietly acquired for exactly this kind of moment. By Thursday morning, he had a badge and a clipboard and legitimate reason to be in every mechanical room and corridor in the building. By noon, he had seen her. Lydia Whitfield was standing on the second-floor mezzanine with a phone pressed to her ear and a coffee she had clearly forgotten getting cold in her other hand. She was her father's daughter in the architecture of her face, and nothing else. Where Franklin Whitfield was broad and blunt and certain, Lydia had been built for precision. Her attention moved through a room the way a surveyor's level moves, deliberate and looking for the thing that isn't quite right. She had been named co-director of property operations 2 years ago, which in the Whitfield Company structure meant she had a title and a desk, and the authority to approve invoices up to $50,000, while the real decisions got made by her father and his longtime COO, a man named Dale Coburn, who had been with Franklin for 20 years and understood that his job was to translate Franklin's instincts into paperwork that held up in court. Emmett had read about Lydia in everything he could find: a business degree from Spelman, 2 years at a commercial real estate firm in Atlanta before her father asked her to come home. She had been quoted in a local business journal piece 18 months ago saying the company needed to diversify its revenue mix, and the quote had been positioned as a sidebar, the kind of sidebar that says we let the junior person speak so we can show the family has young ideas without actually doing anything about them. He recognized the position because he had once been placed in similar ones. She saw him on her way down from the mezzanine. He watched the coffee freeze in her hand, watched her eyes do the thing eyes do when they encounter something they weren't prepared for and don't yet know how to file. Emmett. Her voice came out careful, like a word she'd tested in her mouth before she said it. Mims. Whitfield. He kept his voice even, the practiced neutral of a man on a job site speaking to a building owner, and watched the formality land the way he had known it would. Not unkindly, just clearly. She came down the last 3 stairs too fast. What are you doing here? It wasn't a question. It was a person discovering that the thing they had moved to the back of their mind was standing in front of them with a badge on. Subcontract work, he said. 3rd floor mechanical. You're in HVAC, among other things. She looked at his hands. He let her. He had the kind of hands now that told a specific story. There was work in them, but there was also something else, the steadiness of a man who had stopped moving out of urgency. She was reading him the way you read a document you're not sure is what it claims to be. You left Savannah, she said. I did, and you came back to work on our ventilation system. Somebody had to, he said. Her jaw moved with the word she didn't say. For a moment, he thought she would say the thing they were both standing beside. Her father, the dining room, the verdict at the table. But a man in a gray shirt appeared at the end of the corridor and called her name, and the moment sealed itself shut. Lydia, Coburn's waiting on you. She looked back at Emmett once. There was something in it that hadn't finished forming. Then she turned and walked toward the man in the gray shirt, and Emmett went back to the 3rd floor. And the day continued as though nothing in it had changed. That evening, a car picked him up 3 blocks from the extended stay hotel where he was keeping his things. In the back seat, he made a single call. Where are we on the Exchange Building's management contract? He said. Beverly's voice was the same on any call, flat and exact, like something calibrated. She told him the property management firm had given verbal notice. Formal notice would come inside of 10 days. The lender's covenant clock would start the moment it did, and the secondary acquisition. The Midtown parcel closed yesterday. We're at 31% of the debt pool. Keep going. He paused, quietly. There had been a small item in the Savannah Morning News 2 weeks earlier, 4 sentences, the business section, noting that an unnamed regional investment fund had been accumulating distressed commercial debt across coastal Georgia. The reporter had not been able to identify the fund or its principals. No one in Savannah had thought to look for Emmett Cole's name in connection with it, because the Savannah that Emmett had grown up in did not produce men who ran private equity funds. It produced men who worked for them, occasionally, and usually at the lower end of the org chart. That assumption was the most valuable thing he owned, and he had been careful not to spend it early. He had not intended for any of it to become complicated. That was the truth he kept returning to in the days that followed, the way you return to a sore tooth with your tongue, testing it. He had come to Savannah to let the Whitfield enterprise collapse under the weight of its own mismanagement, to be the one holding the paper when it fell. He did not need to lift a single visible hand. He had built his position patiently, at distance, over 3 years of invisible work, and the system was doing exactly what over-leveraged systems do when no one's managing them carefully. Then he found what Dale Coburn had been doing with the renovation invoices. It happened the way useful things often happen, as a consequence of looking for something else. He had pulled maintenance records to cross-check the HVAC scope of work, and the records didn't match the billing history, and the billing history didn't match the vendor payments. And once he started following the thread, he understood within an afternoon that Dale Coburn had been threading money out of the Whitfield Exchange renovation budget for the better part of 2 years. It wasn't complicated. Coburn had built relationships with 2 vendors, a millwork supplier and an electrical subcontractor, whose invoices consistently billed at 20 to 30% above market rate. The difference moved into a holding account that Coburn controlled through a shell LLC registered in his wife's maiden name. The amounts per transaction were small enough to avoid scrutiny. Across 2 years, they were not small. Franklin Whitfield would never have caught it because Franklin did not read invoices. He read people. He had been reading people for 40 years and deciding he knew what he saw, and he had decided long ago that Dale Coburn was loyal. And to Franklin, loyalty and safety were synonyms. For Emmett, the discovery was a gift and a problem in equal measure. The gift was that Coburn's theft was sitting directly beneath the one property, holding the entire Whitfield structure upright. When it surfaced, and it would surface because these things always did, it would accelerate the collapse Emmett was already positioned to inherit. The problem was Lydia. When the building fell, it would not fall on Franklin, who had the political connections and the generational standing to survive a scandal by distributing its weight across other people. It would fall on Lydia, who had co-signed the operating documents, who had approved invoices she had been told were clean, whose name was on the paperwork in every place where a name was required without any of the information, required to know what the paperwork actually meant. Emmett sat in the break room of a building he was in the process of quietly purchasing the debt on, with a folder of documentation in his lap, and he could not make himself feel good about what he was holding. He told himself it wasn't his problem. He told himself that for 2 days. On the 3rd, he made a copy of everything and left it in the unlocked top drawer of Lydia's office at 6 in the morning, before the building opened, in a plain manila folder with nothing written on the outside. He did it cleanly and completely, the way he did every piece of work he actually cared about, every vendor invoice, every corresponding bank record, every discrepancy annotated in his own hand in black ink in the margin. Anyone who read it would understand within 3 pages exactly what Coburn had done and approximately how much he had taken. It was the kind of analysis that should have required a team and a month. Emmett had done it in 2 evenings because numbers had always been his first language and because he wanted it to be impossible to argue with. He left no name on it. He did not leave a note. He told himself he was being careful. That was not entirely true. A man who had spent 3 years making himself invisible in this city did not accidentally leave behind work this specific. He had written his own handwriting into the margins. He knew she would recognize it. He wanted her to find it. He didn't look too closely at why. She found it before 8. He watched through the glass partition of the corridor as she opened the drawer, picked up the folder, and went still. He watched her flip to the 3rd page and then go back to the 1st. He watched her check the handwriting in the margins twice. He watched her look up and scan the corridor and the building's ground floor through the glass, and he stepped back from the sightline before her eyes found him. She did not come looking for him that morning. That was the first thing that told him she had changed, or grown, or both. The Lydia he had known at 20 would have come straight at him with the folder in her hand, demanding to know what he thought he was doing and why, and what he expected her to do about it, and whether he understood how complicated this was. This one did something quieter and more effective. She spent 3 days saying nothing to anyone. She came in before the building staff and left after them. Emmett watched her pull her own copies of the relevant contracts, watched her sit at her desk with vendor files spread in front of her, watched her build her own version of what he had built, cross-referencing the records against her own independent research. She did not take his word for it. She verified it herself, line by line, because she understood that if she was going to move on this, she needed to be standing on ground no one could pull out from under her. He had handed her a thread. She was building a rope from it. On the 4th morning, she asked Dale Coburn and 2 senior managers to meet her in the 3rd-floor conference room. Emmett was running conduit in the mechanical space adjacent to it. The walls were thinner than they looked. He heard her tell them she was suspending vendor payments pending a comprehensive audit of all renovation billings for the previous 24 months, effective immediately. He heard Coburn's voice climb. "You don't have the standing to freeze those payments. Your father approved this vendor structure personally." "My father approved a vendor structure," Lydia said. "He approved it based on information that I now have reason to believe was inaccurate. I'm not voiding any contracts yet. I'm pausing disbursements until the audit is complete. Every vendor is welcome to submit documentation showing the work was performed as billed. Your father is going to hear about this. I'm meeting with him at noon. I'll be showing him the same documents I just showed you." There was a silence in the room that Emmett could feel even through the wall. "You're making an accusation," Coburn said. "I'm conducting an audit," Lydia said. "If the invoices are clean, the audit will say so. If you're concerned about what it will find, that tells me what I need to know." He heard the conference room door open. He heard footsteps in the corridor. Then he heard Lydia's measured steps going the other direction. Emmett crouched in the mechanical space with a conduit fitting in his hand and understood that she had just done something that could not be undone. She had not run it past her father first. She had not protected the appearance of internal harmony. She had looked at the evidence and she had moved, and Coburn would be on the phone with Franklin Whitfield within 15 minutes. He told himself this was what he had come for. The crack he had spent 3 years positioning around was opening, and her hand was the one doing it. He felt something else entirely, and he had not left room for it in any version of the plan he had made. She found him on the 2nd floor after the building had emptied for the day. He heard her footsteps first, purposeful, not chasing, the stride of someone who had already decided to do the thing they were doing. She stopped in the doorway of the room he was working in. "The handwriting in the margins," she said. "You learned it in Mrs. Presley's AP Calc class. She made everyone annotate problems the same way." He set down the tool he was holding. "You already knew what was in the folder," she said. "Before you left it. You had already done the whole analysis." "Yes. How long have you known?" "About Coburn? 3 weeks." She was quiet for a moment. Then, "What else do you know?" He looked at her. He thought about the answer to that question and what it contained. "More than I've told you." She held his eyes. "Are you here to help my family or take it apart?" "I came here to let it fall," he said, because she deserved something true, and because he had the sense that she already knew enough of the shape of the answer that lying would cost him more than it gained. "I didn't come here for you. You were the part I didn't plan for." She stayed in the doorway a moment longer. "You should have led with that," she said. "Not angry, just naming it, the way an engineer names a fault." She turned and left, and Emmett stood in the empty room and felt the weight of what he was carrying shift into a different configuration. Franklin Whitfield found out about the audit before dinner. He called his daughter twice. She did not answer. He called Coburn, who told him a version of events that put himself in the role of victim and Lydia in the role of rogue operator. Franklin listened, hung up, and did what he had always done when something moved against the direction he had planned. He applied force from the top. He came to the building the next morning and he found Emmett. Not by chance. By then, Someone on the facilities staff had told someone in building management that the HVAC subcontractor had been seen talking to Lydia after hours more than once, and building management had told Coburn, and Coburn had told Franklin, and Franklin was not a man who heard things like that without acting on them. He found Emmett on the first floor, and he stood in the restored lobby of the building he had spent $1 million on. And he looked at Emmett Cole the way he had looked at him across a dinner table 4 years ago. "I don't know what game you're running," Franklin said, "but I know you're not here for the ventilation system. And I know you've been in my daughter's ear, and I am telling you for the last time that what I said 4 years ago stands. I don't need to know your angle to tell you that whatever you're looking for here, you're not going to find it." Emmett looked at him steadily. "I'm not looking for anything from you, Mr. Whitfield. Then what are you doing in my building?" "Right now," Emmett said. "My job." Franklin's jaw tightened. He was a man who had built his life on the ability to press people until they revealed what they were. He pressed now the way he always pressed, by making a person feel small in a large space. "Son," he said with great deliberate patience, "I have known men like you my entire life. You find something with cracks in it, and you work your fingers into the cracks, and you call it opportunity. That's not a criticism. That's just what you are. But this family is not a crack for you to work." 3 years ago, a sentence like that had sent Emmett out a front door and into 4 years of building something that could come back and prove it wrong. He had run that scene through his head more times than he could count, and in every version, he said something precisely devastating in return. He did not say anything devastating now. He looked at Franklin Whitfield, and he saw a man who had dressed up fear in the language of judgment. For so long, he could no longer tell the difference between the two. And he felt something that was not quite pity, and not quite contempt, but contained elements of both, along with something else he had not expected: clarity. "You should look at your operating accounts, Mr. Whitfield," Emmett said. "Before you worry about what I'm doing in your building, you should look at what's been happening in your own." He went back to work, and Franklin stood in the lobby of his flagship building and looked at the back of a young man in a work jacket walking away from him and felt, for the first time in a long time, the specific discomfort of being the person in the room who knows the least. The thing about men like Franklin Whitfield was that they did not sit with discomfort. They converted it immediately into action. By the end of the day, he had made calls, applied pressure on the facilities management company to end the subcontract, and begun assembling the justification to remove Lydia from her operational role before she could take the audit any further. If he controlled the outcome, he could control what got found, or more precisely, what got buried. He also had people look into Emmett more seriously than he had before. What came back was surface clean, a contractor's license, work history that verified, references that checked out, no debt, no record, no trail of anything large. A young black man from the south side of Savannah who had left 4 years ago and come back to work on HVAC systems. But one of Franklin's people, a man who moved money through structures that did not advertise their existence, mentioned in passing that there was a private fund, based out of Atlanta, principals unnamed, that had been buying up distressed commercial debt in coastal Georgia for the better part of 3 years, and that a name adjacent to that fund had surfaced once briefly in connection with a contractor's license renewal in Chatham County. Franklin read that the way Franklin read everything, through the architecture of his own assumptions. He concluded that Emmett was a scout, a low man sent in by a larger operation to assess the property from the inside before the fund moved to acquire it. That a man like Emmett could himself be the fund, could himself be the principal, did not occur to him. The frame of his entire life made it structurally impossible. The conclusion frightened him, and frightened men with resources make predictable errors. He called a meeting of the Whitfield Company's board of directors. 5 people, 2 of them family, 2 of them longtime allies, 1 of them an outside director who had been on the board long enough to feel like furniture. And he laid out a resolution to strip Lydia of her operational authority, void the pending audit on the grounds that it had been conducted without proper authorization, and authorize an emergency sale of the Whitfield Exchange building and its associated debt at whatever price the market would bear, before whatever predator was circling could get its structure in place. He would burn the asset down himself rather than lose it to someone else's hands. Lydia learned about the board meeting from her cousin the night before it was scheduled. She called Emmett from the parking garage of her apartment building at 10 o'clock at night, standing between two concrete pillars, with the phone at her ear, and her voice stripped down to the essential. "He's calling a board meeting tomorrow morning. He's going to remove me from operations and sell the exchange." Emmett was quiet for a moment. "I know." A beat of silence. "You know, my attorney called an hour ago. He has enough family votes to pass the resolution if it goes to a standard count." Another silence, longer. "Emmett." Her voice had something careful in it now, something precise. "How does your attorney know what's on the agenda for my family's board meeting before I do?" He closed his eyes. There it was. The question he had been carrying since the day he left the folder in her drawer. "Come to my hotel," he said. "I'll tell you everything." She sat across from him at the small table by the window, with the Savannah River visible in the distance, and the room between them feeling narrower than its square footage suggested. He did not make her wait or build to it. He laid it out from the beginning. The night he left the Whitfield house, the 6 months he had spent sleeping on a cousin's couch in Atlanta learning to code, the logistics software he had built, out of spite and necessity that turned into a licensing deal, the deal that turned into the patent that turned into the kind of money that moves quietly when you let it, the fund, the debt acquisition, the 3 years of systematic patient positioning around the Whitfield portfolio. The reason his badge on the building said what it said. He told her about the $38 that had been in his checking account the night her father dismissed him. He told her what it had felt like to hear the verdict in that room and understand that no fact about who he actually was would have changed it. He told her about the folder he had left in her drawer and that it hadn't been an accident. She listened without interrupting. He had expected anger. What he got was something harder to read. Attention, precise and total, the kind of attention a person gives to a document they are deciding whether to trust. When he finished, the room was quiet for a moment. "You were going to let it fall," she said. "The whole company. You had the position to do it. You were just going to wait." "Yes." "And then you found Coburn's numbers." "Yes." "And instead of using them to speed the collapse, you left them for me." "Yes." She looked at him. Why? He had been over this answer enough times to know what was true and what was just convenient. Because it would have landed on you, not on him. You were the name on the paperwork and the person who didn't know what the paperwork was covering, and I couldn't. He stopped. "I couldn't make myself do it. That's not the same as being innocent of what you were planning before." "No," he agreed. "It's not." She was quiet for a long time. Outside, the river moved in the dark the way it always had, unhurried, indifferent. "He's going to call that meeting at 9, she said finally, "and I have nothing that changes the vote count." "You have the audit," Emmett said. "It's not finished. It doesn't have to be finished to be on the table. What you have is enough to change the conversation in that room, even if it doesn't change the vote." He paused. "And there's something else." He slid a document across the table. She picked it up. "My attorney will be at that meeting," he said, "with the full acquisition record. 3 years of debt purchases, converted positions, open market acquisitions. The fund holds 44.2% of the voting interest in the Whitfield enterprise." She set the document down. Then she picked it up again. 44%. It's the single largest block at the table. Your father assembled enough overnight to get to 29. He doesn't have the room to pass the resolution without my votes. She looked up from the document. "So you could stop it?" "Yes." "Why are you telling me this at 10 o'clock the night before, instead of just doing it?" He looked at her across the small table, and he said the thing he had spent the whole conversation working toward, and was only now certain was true. "Because I spent 3 years building something to take your father apart, and I'm sitting here not wanting to use it. And I needed you to know that before I walked into that room. Because what happens tomorrow You should be choosing it, not walking into the last act of something I already wrote." She was quiet for a long time. "You should have told me when you left that folder," she said. "I know. You should have told me the night I asked you what else you knew. I know. Why didn't you? Because by the time it stopped being a weapon, I was afraid it would sound like one anyway. I couldn't find the version of the sentence that didn't make everything we'd said to each other feel like a stage I'd built." He held her eyes. "That was my failure. I'm telling you now because it's all I have left to give you that cost me something real." She looked at the document for a moment. Then she looked at him. "If I walk into that meeting tomorrow," she said, "I need to know I'm walking in as myself, not as a piece of something you set up. You built the case on Coburn yourself," he said. "Brick by brick. What you bring into that room is yours, and your votes. Tell me what to do with them," he said simply. "They're yours if you want them. The fund's controlling interest. I'll assign proxy to you. Not ownership. I earned that money and I'm keeping it. But the votes, the control, every decision that entity makes in the Whitfield enterprise, that goes through you, not through me." She looked at him for a long time. "You built 44% of my family's company," she said slowly, "so you could give it to me. I built it to make your father answer for what he said. And I'm sitting here understanding that the version of this I actually want doesn't look anything like what I planned." He paused. "You were the part I didn't plan for. You've been the part I didn't plan for since the second day I was in that building." She didn't say anything, but she picked up the document and held it and did not put it back down. The Whitfield board met at 9 in the morning in a conference room on the 7th floor of a downtown building, and Franklin took the chair at the head of the table with the certainty of a man whose script was already written. He had the votes. He had the language. He had spent 30 years making sure that when he needed a room, the room was already his before anyone sat down. Lydia sat halfway down the table, a folder in front of her, no allies visible. Franklin opened the meeting and moved immediately to the resolution: removal of Lydia's operational authority, audit termination, authorization for emergency asset sale. He read it in the register of a man doing a reasonable thing with considerable patience. When he finished, he looked at his daughter with the expression of a man who believes he is protecting something. "This isn't about you," he said. "It's about protecting what we have left." Lydia opened her folder. "Before the board votes," she said, "I'd like to present the findings from the first phase of the vendor audit. These are the Whitfield Exchange renovation invoices for 23 months, cross-referenced against county permit records, inspection logs, and third-party market rate comparisons for the relevant trades." She slid copies down the table. "I'd like someone on this board to explain how we paid $162,000 to 2 vendors over 18 months for work that permit records show was never inspected. Because work that was never inspected was never performed. Those payments went somewhere. I can show you where." The room changed. One of the outside board members, a gray-haired man named Gerald Marsh, who had been in commercial real estate for 40 years, had already picked up the pages and was reading with the attention of someone who recognized what he was looking at. Franklin's voice came in sharp. "Lydia, this is not the matter on the table. Fraud in our operating accounts is absolutely the matter on the table," she said, and her voice was steady in a way that did not match her age, the steadiness of someone who built something solid before they needed to stand on it. "If you'd like to vote to remove the person who found it, the minutes will reflect exactly what that vote was in response to." Gerald Marsh put the papers down and looked at Franklin Whitfield. "Franklin," he said carefully, "do you know about this?" The room was waiting. That was the moment the door opened. Emmett Cole walked in, and the room did not know what to do with him. He was not in a work jacket. He wore a dark suit that said nothing about itself because it did not need to, cut by a tailor who did not advertise. He crossed the room with the ease of a man who had been in rooms exactly like this one many times and had no remaining uncertainty about whether he belonged in them. Behind him, Beverly Okafor set a leather portfolio on the conference table with a sound like something closing. "My name is Beverly Okafor. I'm counsel to the principal shareholder of the entities that hold the Whitfield family's outstanding commercial debt. My client asked me to be present this morning. I'd recommend the board hear what I have to say before any votes are cast. She opened the portfolio. She did not rush. She laid out 3 years of acquisition records, debt assignments, converted positions, open market purchases, all of it assembled into a document that made the pattern legible without any need for explanation. 44.2%, single largest voting interest in the room, greater than the family block Franklin had assembled overnight by 15 points. Franklin's eyes moved from the portfolio to the man in the dark suit standing beside the attorney, and the arithmetic collapsed all at once. "You," he said. The word came out without architecture. "Yes," Emmett said. "You work on ventilation systems. I did that work, yes." Emmett kept his voice level. "The permit's clean, if you want to check." Franklin's face moved through several expressions before it settled. "You were sent here." "No." Emmett stepped forward. "That's what you needed to be true, because the other answer was one you'd organized your whole life against. You looked at a 22-year-old with nothing, and you decided you already knew everything there was to know about him. And then you spent 4 years not updating that picture." He paused. "Nobody sent me, Mr. Whitfield. I built it myself. Starting the week after you told me at your dinner table that my kind doesn't build things that last." The room was absolutely still. He turned to the board. 2 items. First, the resolution removing Lydia Whitfield from operational authority. I'm calling my voting interest against it. And I'm asking that the minutes reflect the context in which it was brought, which is that it was filed in response to her having correctly identified internal fraud. Second, I'm calling my interest to place the vendor audit under the oversight of an independent forensic accounting firm, with findings to be reported directly to this board. He looked at Franklin Whitfield, not with triumph, with something quieter, the acknowledgement of a man who has arrived at the end of something and found it smaller than he expected. "You can keep the chair," Emmett said. "That's not what I came for." Gerald Marsh called the vote because someone had to. The room voted the only way the numbers allowed it to vote. Afterward, when the board had filed out and Dale Coburn had left without meeting anyone's eyes, and Beverly had gathered her portfolio and made herself scarce, Lydia and Emmett stood on opposite sides of the conference table in the emptying room. She looked at him the way you look at a map when you realize it's been oriented wrong the whole time you've been following it. 4 years, she said. 4 years. The whole time I thought you'd just moved on, built a life somewhere else. I thought you were fine. I was building, he said. I don't know if that's the same as fine. She picked up the proxy document Beverly had left on the table, the one assigning the fund's voting interest to Lydia. She turned it over once. You're giving me control of 44% of my own family's company. I'm giving you the votes, he said. Keep the structure, keep the company out of worse hands than mine. But the decisions, those are yours. You didn't have to do that. No, he agreed. I didn't. She set the document down. You should have told me on the first day. I know. In the building that first day on the mezzanine. You should have told me. I know. I was still deciding which version of the story I was in. He looked at her. I spent 4 years writing a story where the ending was your father understanding what it cost to be wrong. And somewhere along the way, the story changed without me noticing until I was already in the last chapter. She picked up the proxy document again. She did not sign it yet. If I sign this, she said, I need to know it's because I chose to, not because you set me up to choose it. You built the case on Coburn yourself, he said. You walked into this room with your own folder. That was yours before I ever got here. She considered him for a long moment. Then she signed it. Across the room, Franklin Whitfield had not moved from the head of the table he no longer controlled. He had heard all of it. He had heard the votes. He had heard the proxy. He had heard his daughter ask whether she was choosing or being maneuvered. And he had heard the answer. And something in him that had been held rigid for a very long time was coming apart at the joints. Slowly, the way old structures come apart when the load-bearing assumptions get removed. He had spent 4 years certain that Emmett Cole had left his dining room and proved him right by disappearing. That was the story he had needed. That a young man with nothing and a certain kind of hunger had been correctly identified and correctly removed before he could do damage. The story had held up because Emmett had not been visible, and absence reads as absence. Now Franklin was sitting in a room that Emmett had just reshaped without raising his voice, and the story didn't hold anymore. And the thing that had organized everything underneath it, the conviction that he could read people accurately enough to protect what he loved, was sitting in pieces on the table in front of him. He thought about what the man had said. "My kind doesn't build things that last." He had said that. He had believed it the way he believed the things you believe when you've never been required to examine them. "I owe you an accounting," Franklin said. His voice came out rough and unfamiliar, the voice of a man using a register he did not often access. Emmett turned. "What I said 4 years ago." Franklin stopped, restarted. "I said it because I believed it was true. I said it because I had a framework for men who came in with nothing and a good way of presenting themselves, and I put you in it. And I was wrong." He looked at the table. "I've been wrong about you since the night I showed you out of my house." Emmett looked at him for a long moment. "Yes," she said, "you were." He did not soften it, but he did not sharpen it either. "You built a company that's going to need real management to survive the next 2 years, Emmett said. "Not the management it's been getting. Your daughter can do that. She was doing it before any of this, and she would have found Coburn eventually without me. You taught her to be careful enough to catch the thing you were too confident to look for. That's worth something, even if it was an accident." Franklin looked at his daughter. Whatever passed between them was private and complex and had decades in it. It was not forgiveness. It was too early for that, and they were both too clear-eyed to call it something it wasn't. But it was the beginning of a different conversation, and that was more than either of them had walked in with. 6 months later, the Whitfield Exchange was fully leased and operating under a management structure Lydia had rebuilt from the ground up. Dale Coburn had resigned under the weight of the forensic audit, and the matter had been referred to the district attorney's office with a 200-page document that Beverly Okafor had compiled with evident satisfaction. Lydia ran the company through her own decisions, her own signature on contracts that meant what they said. The board that had once assembled to remove her now waited to hear what she thought before they moved. She had not been installed there by anyone. She had built her standing in the same room where they had tried to take it from her, and everybody who mattered knew it. Franklin had a smaller role, an advisory seat, no operating authority, the kind of position that lets a man stay connected to the thing he built without driving it into a wall. He took it without grace at first, and then with more of it slowly, the way a person learns a posture they never expected to need. He watched his daughter work. He watched the man she was building a life with walk into rooms and change them without needing anyone's permission. And the framework he had carried for 40 years, the one that had told him he knew exactly what kind of man Emmett Cole was before he'd had enough information to know anything, continued slowly to come apart. Not with drama, with evidence, the quietest and most irrefutable kind of rebuttal. On the evening of the exchange's reopening, Emmett and Lydia stood in the restored courtyard at the building's center, the old brick walls lit warm in the October dusk. The city doing what Savannah does in the fall, turning just gold enough to remind you it was always this beautiful, and you just stopped noticing. "You could have run all of it," Lydia said. 44%. That's controlling if you hold it right." "I know," he said. "Most people would have. I didn't build it to run it," he said. "I built it to put it down in front of you." She took his hand. There was nothing of the distance left in it, none of the careful architecture he had maintained for months. No carpenter, no badge, no unnamed fund. Just 2 people standing in a courtyard that had once been a symbol of what he couldn't touch, understanding that the symbol had been wrong about him the whole time. 4 years ago, somebody told me what I was," he said. "I spent 4 years building the answer, and somewhere in the middle of building it, I realized the answer wasn't for him." She looked at him. "It was for you," he said. It just took me a while to figure out which one it was. The courtyard was full of the people the Whitfields had invited to celebrate the building's new chapter. But Emmett and Lydia stood a little apart from the lights and the conversation, in the space where old cities breathe, and there was nothing between them anymore that needed explaining to anyone. There's something I want to ask you before you go. Emmett built 44% of a company that could have made him the most powerful person in that boardroom, and he handed the votes to the woman he loved instead. Some of you are going to say he was right to do it. Some of you, and I understand this, wanted him to keep it, wanted him to sit in that chair and make Franklin Whitfield answer to him every day. There's no wrong feeling there. That impulse is honest. But here's what I keep coming back to. Emmett didn't give away the money. He kept what he earned. He gave away the control, which is a different thing entirely. He built the weapon and then he chose not to be a man who needs a weapon. That's the harder version of winning. Most people never find out they're capable of it. So here's what I really want to know. Most of us have had a Franklin Whitfield somewhere, a person who looked at us and made a decision before they had the information. Someone who measured us by the wrong scale and called it discernment. If you've been on the wrong end of that, or if you've watched someone you care about prove that kind of person wrong, I'd love to hear about it in the comments. Tell me what happened. Tell me what it cost. Tell me what it built. Your stories are where the best of these scripts come from, and the ones you share have a way of becoming the next one I get to write.